All right, moving on then. In Lessing's Education of the Human Race, we are up to aphorism number 53, where he says, a better instructor must come and snatch the exhausted primer from the child's grasp. Christ came. Child's grasp, referring to the Hebrews of the Old Testament. That was the old dispensation, the childhood of man. Now we are moving into the new dispensation. And so he says that there's a footnote, by the way, that points out that originally this document ended here at aphorism 53 with Christ arriving. And so he ended it there initially and published it in 1777. Then he went back and added the rest of it, these next sections, in 1780. So that sounds to me like originally he did not have Joachim's three-stage theory in mind at first when he sat down to write this. Then he must have encountered Joachim's works, or the works of his followers, more likely. He mentions Christian mystics of the 13th and 14th centuries who were his followers. So perhaps he was studying theology, so perhaps he came upon their texts and then realized, I have to flesh out that second age, and there's a third age, a third dispensation, that of the Holy Spirit, that has to be discussed. And so I think he went back then and then finished it, republished it in 1780 with the second age mapped out. So he says that portion of the human race which God had wished to include in one educational plan was now ready for the second great step in its education. But he only wished to include in this plan that portion of humanity which by its language, activities, government, and other natural and political circumstances was already united in itself. In other words, the Roman Empire. The language is Latin. The government, the activities are the victories. Augustus being victorious over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, which is decisive and final and ends the Roman civil wars. And now you've got a stable, unified empire, what Toynbee calls a universal state, which means, by definition, that it's unified. So Lessing is saying that God had to wait for this creation of this stable, unified state before we could get to this second dispensation, this second revelation. So he says this portion of the human race had come so far in the exercise of its reason that it required and could make use of nobler and worthier motives for moral action than just temporal rewards and punishments, which had hitherto been its guide. Sweets and playthings give way to a desire to become as free, as honored, and as happy as its elder siblings, the child who becomes a boy. And so he says the better members of that portion of the human race had already long been accustomed to let themselves be governed by a shadow of such nobler motives. The Greek or Roman would do anything to live on after this life, if only in the memory of his fellow citizens. It was time for the expectation of another true life after this life to gain an influence on their actions. And so then he says Christ becomes the first reliable and practical teacher of the immortality of the soul. And that's the whole point, is Christ embodies this idea of the immortality of the soul, both through his teachings and through his actions. And so he says Christ is the first reliable teacher, the first practical teacher. And in aphorism 60, he says, it's one thing to conjecture, desire, and believe in the immortality of the soul as a philosophical speculation, as, say, the Pharisees did. And another to direct one's inner and outer actions accordingly, which is what Christ did. And so note here, he definitely sees the New Testament as better than the Old Testament, and Christianity as a better religion than Judaism, which undercuts a bit his point that he made in his play Nathan the Wise, that all three religions are equal, of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They don't come across as equal here in this document, which is chronological and unfolds through time, whereas Nathan the Wise is more of a spatial recognition of these three different religions living side by side, each tolerating the other equally. So the first to teach this was Christ. So this idea of the immortality of the soul that he embodies is the most important thing that moves away from what he calls the Judaic sensualism. He sees the Jews as having been more firmly tied to the senses than Christianity, as does Franz Borkenau, once again in his essay on the death cycles, where he takes Toynbee's three different generations of civilization, the first generation being the Mesopotamians and the Sumerians, which is purely religious, and the second generation being the Greeks, the Hebrews, the Persians, China, India, and so forth, as the second generation, and the third generation coming in with the universal churches, Christianity, Mahayana Buddhism, and Islam, and all the different species of Christianity in that generation. So, and Borkenau says, so the first generation is death transcending. With Egypt, we get the celebration of the afterlife as the whole point of the civilization, but then we get the death accepting civilization in the second generation, which is the Greeks and the Hebrews aren't so interested in the afterlife. India doesn't really fit this model, doesn't fit it at all, and neither does China. But for the Greeks and Hebrews, it is true that they have this concrete emphasis. They don't care about the afterlife like they do this world. Hades goes dark. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus goes down into the underworld, into Hades, it's dark now. And Achilles is just a weak shade that he encounters there. The underworld wasn't dark for the Egyptians. It was a brightly lit, beautiful place. It was self-luminous, let's say. So the underworld did go dark in the second generation after the Indo-Aryan invasions and the Indo-European invasions have taken place. So it is another, there is a gap there. It's a different thing now. And so he says, it is, and then here's the explicit statement in Aphorism 64, where he says, it is at least already clear from experience that the New Testament scriptures, in which these doctrines were eventually recorded, have served and continue to serve as the second better primer for the human race. So this is an advance. This is the education of the human race, where these truths were initially revealed through the Gospels and the book of Revelation. They were revealed. But he calls them rational truths. So these are rational truths that first had to be revealed through the guise of revelation, because the human intellect was not yet ready to understand them rationally. But by the time of the Enlightenment, he says these revealed truths now have to be transformed into rational truths. And that's the process of enlightenment, Aufklärung, that is going on here. So this is why, you're getting a rational religion here, but there isn't anything rational about religion. Structure, form, maybe, beauty, cosmology, sure, but it's not rational. There's nothing rational about the immortality of the soul. But this is the Enlightenment, and this is the way it's being presented. Okay, so then he says in Aphorism 72, just as we are now able to dispense with the Old Testament for the doctrine of God's unity, the Old Testament established the monotheistic idea. That was its purpose, point, and telos. And just as we are also gradually beginning to be able to dispense with the New Testament for the doctrine of the soul's immortality, that's interesting because he's preparing you for the third epoch here. Might there not also be further truths of this kind adumbrated in the New Testament, which we must wonder at as revelations, until human reason has learned to deduce them from its other established truths, and to link them with these? For example, the doctrine of the Trinity. So the doctrine of the Trinity is, in addition to the immortality of the soul and the survival into an afterlife, which the Gospels teach, is this important doctrine of the Trinity, which is this idea that God is a unity through a plurality. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all consubstantial. They are three different emanations, or three different hypostases, let's say, of the one primary substance, as Spinoza would put it, that is God. God is the primary substance of which his Son and the Holy Spirit are carrying out his actions on the earthly plane. But he is still a unity, not a plurality. So this is, he teaches this, he says this is a rational truth. There's nothing rational about three different beings who are three different beings, but yet they're the same being. Now it's interesting because the bishop, let's glance for a second at the Arian heresy, where Bishop Arius here, in 250 AD, suggested the heretical idea that the God, the Father, was primary, and the Son was subordinate to him, because there was a time when it was only God, and he hadn't yet incarnated as the Son. And so the Arian heresy is a heresy because it says that the plurality is a plurality, not a unity. They are not consubstantial. Christ is inferior to God. They are two different entities. And so the problem with that is that it slips back into a kind of polytheism then. We have three different deities, which appealed to the German barbarians. And so the first form of Christianity that came into Europe was picked up by the German barbarians, especially the Visigoths, who liked this idea because of its polytheism. They could simply take that sign regime of the Arian idea and graft it on to their older Scandinavian mythological sign regime. And they could say, oh, Christ was hung on a tree? Well, so was Wotan. Wotan hung himself on a tree and sacrificed one of his eyes in order to get knowledge, the world tree, Yggdrasil. So they recognized, so the German barbarians did this series of concordances or recognitions. Concordances are what Joachim would call them, recognitions between things like Yggdrasil and the tree of the cross that Christ hung from. And so when they come storming into Rome in 411, led by Alaric the Visigoth, they are actually Christians. They're Arian Christians. But the Arian heresy was condemned at the First Council of Nicaea, and so it did not survive in Europe. The idea is unity, not plurality. We don't want to regress back to polytheism, is the idea. Okay. And then he also talks about, and the doctrine of original sin. He says, what if everything should finally convince us that man, at the first and lowest stage of his humanity, let's say man as Adam, is quite simply not sufficiently in control of his actions to be able to follow moral laws. So he's not in control of his actions at first, which is why he picks the fruit and we get the fall. But then over time, as he matures, he is then given moral laws. Lessing says in the next aphorism, he is then given moral laws, and God will forgive all of human transgressions in consideration only of his Son, who sort of wipes the slate of original sin clean. Now, the deists did not believe in original sin. They did not believe in the idea of a fall. They rejected all of that. Our founding fathers were deists. And so we get this idea, original sin is something then, for Augustine, that is transmitted through semen, actually, which is why it was so important for Christ to be born from a virgin, to break that line of the transmission of original sin through semen. So we have a religion here with Christianity that rejects sex, that condemns the genitals as sinful. Everything about Christianity is based on a complete rejection of human sexuality. You have Father Origen, way back around 200. He's almost a contemporary of Arius, castrating himself. And then later on, Augustine will say, woman is a temple built above a sewer. So the genitals are not, they're not part of Christianity. That's one thing that has been left out and tied in with this idea of original sin and the tendency of human beings to sin. So also, he also discusses the mysteries here. The idea, he says, let it not be objected that such rational speculations on the mysteries of religion are forbidden. The word mystery in early Christian times meant something quite different from what we understand by it now. And the development of revealed truths into truths of reason is absolutely necessary if they are to be of any help to the human race. When they were revealed, of course, they were not yet truths of reason, but they were revealed in order to become such truths. So this is the Enlightenment, and his whole point here in this paper is to create a rational religion, a religion without mystery, a religion within which the mysteries have been sterilized. They're just gone. So it's a very shallow kind of worldview, in my opinion, and I think in Spengler's as well. Okay, and then he moves right along here, and then eventually gets to the idea of a third epoch. So, which I think was suggested back here about where he says that there will come a new gospel. A new and eternal gospel must follow. I'm trying to find it here. Let's see. And the aim of the education here, he wants to highlight this. If this is the aim of human education, can divine education fall short of it? Because the education of the human race, as he had said at the start of the document, that education and revelation are the same thing for him, is that the education of the human race is leading towards its enlightenment. Enlightenment is its telos and its goal, Aufklärung. To transform those truths of revelation into truths of reason is the whole goal of the education of the human race. And aphorism number 86, he says, well, it will certainly come, the time of a new eternal gospel, which is promised to us even in the primers of the New Covenant, by which he is referring to the book of Revelation. So there was always a third age that, in a way, was implicit in the New Testament. In John, the Gospel of John, Christ talks about the coming of a paraclete. A paraclete, which means a comforter, will be sent at some point in the future. And it's this mysterious line. The prophet Mani, who tried to synthesize Zoroastrianism with Christianity and Buddhism around that time, as the sort of apotheosis, let's say, of Gnosticism, presented himself as the Paraclete. He said, I am the incarnation of the Paraclete, and my task is to synthesize these three world religions. And so we have a movement into this third generation of civilization in which now we get religions that ignore ethnicity. It doesn't matter. The whole problem with Judaism is that it's based on pure ethnicity. You have to be born of a Jewish mother, or you're not a real Jew. You can't just become a Jew. It doesn't work that way. Whereas in the third generation, with those three great religions of Islam, Mahayana Buddhism, and Christianity, we get religions of credo where your ethnicity does not matter. And so as a result of that, all you have to do is say, I believe in any of those three religions, and you're in. Doesn't matter what your skin color is. And as the result of that, those religions that spread across the earth, which is why you get a third generation of civilization and why these religions are so powerful, because they're so huge and they're transnational. So he sees the coming of a third age here, and he, in section 87, a third age, whereas I see the coming of a fourth generation of civilization where, as I've written in one of my essays on Substack, on the coming world religion, for me it's a fourth age. So I've inherited the four-stage model. I've taken Toynbee's three generations and added a fourth generation, which I see as on the way, as the world's first single planetary religion that will do what Mani was trying to do by uniting Buddhism with Christianity and Zoroastrianism. If Islam had been around in his day, it would have been Islam that he would have tried to unite with those other two. And so in that essay, I flesh out what that might look like if these three religions somehow were successfully synthesized, as Mani tried to do, but he was anathematized as a heretic in the Zoroastrian world there. So he says, perhaps even enthusiasts, and the translation, I've read other translations where it says mystics, perhaps even certain mystics of the 13th and 14th centuries caught a glimpse of this new eternal gospel and erred only in proclaiming that its coming was so close at hand, because Joachim had said that it was supposed to dawn in 1260, but it never happened. So he's referring obliquely here to Joachim of Florus, because his followers then also wrote texts throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. And it's his followers that he's referring to here. And he says in section 88, perhaps their 3 ages of the world were not just an empty fancy, and they certainly had no ill intentions when they taught that the new covenant must become just as antiquated as the old has become. For them, too, it was still the same economy of the same God. It was still, to put it in my terms, the same plan of the universal education of the human race. So he sees a 3rd age to come here, the old age of humanity. The child has grown up, become a man in the 2nd age, and is now moving on into the old age. And then so in the last 10 sections here, he starts talking about reincarnation, rather astonishingly. He says in section 93, exactly so, every individual, one sooner, another later, must first have traversed the same route whereby the race attains its perfection. But can he have traversed it in one and the same lifetime? Can he in this life have been both a sensual Jew and a spiritual Christian? Can he have overtaken both of them in this same life? Well, surely not. But why should every individual not have been present more than once in this world? He says, astonishingly, as Steiner points out, it is astonishing that this becomes the whole climax of the work here. He says, is this hypothesis so ridiculous just because it's the oldest one? Because the human understanding hit upon it at once before it was distracted and weakened by the sophistry of the schools? So he's saying reincarnation was there with paganism, as it certainly was in India, for a very long time. It may go back to the Harappan civilization of 2600 BC in India. We have pictures of people in yoga posture on little stamp seals from that civilization. And then he says, and then it was wrecked by reason, the sophistries of the schools, which excluded it. And he says in section 96, why should I not likewise have already taken all the steps here towards my perfection, which merely temporal rewards and punishments can lead mankind to take? In 97, he says, and why should I not on another occasion have taken all those steps which the prospects of eternal rewards give us so strong an incentive to take? And in 98, gets to his last 3 aphorisms. Why should I not come back as often as I am able to acquire new knowledge and new accomplishments? Do I take away so much on one occasion that it may not be worth the trouble coming back? And in 99, should I not come back because of this, or because I forget that I have been here before? It is as well that I should forget. The memory of my previous states would only permit me to make poor use of the present one. And what does what I must forget for the present have to be forgotten forever? So it is true, we do reincarnate, and we're born with a blank slate, most of us, and we can't remember our previous lives, and there's a reason for that. Remembering your previous lives can become an impediment to learning in this one. Plus, it's just too many fucking memories. I don't think the brain is really built to, the human brain is really built for that. It's built to be anchored in this lifetime so that you can focus on the tasks and the karma that has brought you here to this particular lifetime. And finally he says, or am I not to return because too much time would be lost in so doing? Lost? What exactly do I have to lose? Is not the whole of eternity mine? Fantastic. It's a great essay. Even though Lessing is a Socratic man and it's a rational religion, he gets credit for being one of the very few in the West who, and it's almost like he just stumbles on reincarnation. Like, oh, and by the way, he just sort of adds it in there. And who knows where it came from and where he got it. Fascinating that he does, though. Schopenhauer also believes in reincarnation. He writes a paper, he calls it Palingenesis, but it's one of his late essays. It's not part of the structure of his main work, The World as Will and Representation. It's not in there. So Schopenhauer seems to have come to it as well late in life, and it's as though the German mind is retrieving this idea, and here it has nothing to do with connections to theosophy. When the theosophists come in and they meet Rudolf Steiner, who is starting off just trying to figure out what's he going to do, become a hardcore, he's come out of the academy as a hardcore German idealist philosopher editing Goethe's writings, and the theosophists then gave him permission to leave that world behind and say, no, we've been over in India and we think reincarnation is a real thing, and so he came out of the closet and became a mystic. My favorite mystic, and I think the best, I think that Rudolf Steiner's work has the best presentation in the West that you're going to get on the laws and dynamics of karma and reincarnation and how it works. So that's why I still have to finish his karmic relationships series, but I just wanted to take a detour here and go over Lessing. All right, so that's Lessing's Education of the Human Race.